Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Oval Cricket Ground here in London. A welcome to those of you here in person and to those of you joining us online as well. We're here today to launch Fighting the Last War, the WHO and International Tobacco Control. This major report is one of the Global State of Tobacco Harm Reduction series, which always commands attention. I'm Godfrey, the founding editor of Filter, the online magazine, and I'm joined today by the author himself, Shapiro, global health advocate Derek Yuck, and consumer advocate Tom Gleeson. We'll hear talks from all three of them, and then you, the audience, here and online, will have the opportunity to bowl some questions their way. But I'll start, if I may, just by pulling out a couple of headlines from the report itself. The report notes, essentially, that the number of smokers in absolute terms is about the same today as it was 20 years ago, at 1.1 billion people worldwide. That translates into around 8 million annual smoking-related deaths globally, and a projected figure by the end of this century of 1 billion smoking-related deaths. And that's why we're all here today. As the report outlines, despite the emergence of myriad safer ways to consume nicotine, we're talking vaping products, heated tobacco products, oral nicotine options as well, all of them viable and effective harm reduction alternatives for smokers. Despite the emergence of all of this, the WHO and its NGO allies remain entrenched in an historic battle against tobacco companies, which has led them to become opposed to the consumption of nicotine per se. And nicotine, of course, as we know, is not the cause of significant harms. International Tobacco Control, urges the report, must refocus on delivering tangible outcomes that reduce death and disease. And some of the means of achieving this include parties to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control taking and exercising control over that treaty rather than leaving it to the WHO Secretariat. And also, the WHO's Empower implementation strategy must be reconfigured to address these severe deficiencies. Well, rather than hearing me try to explain it, let's hear it from the horse's mouth, because we have here author Shapiro. He's the director of DrugWise. He's an acclaimed writer, editor, and communications professional. He's got 40 years of experience in the drugs field, and since 2015 has been working with Knowledge Action Change on tobacco harm reduction, in which capacity he's the executive director of the Global State of Tobacco Harm Reduction series, and he's going to be talking to us today with the rather dispiritingly but understandably titled speech, From Hope to Despair, Tobacco Control Loses Its Way. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand here, by the way, because I might think life's a lot easier when I've got a speech to read, if I'm actually got somewhere to put the bits of paper. So my other fellow panellists, I think, may be well staying where they are, but I need to be here. I just wanted a kind of caveat before I start. A very good friend of mine, Ethan Nadelman, at a meeting yesterday, made a very good point. And what he said was that everybody involved in this public health space is invested in tobacco control. So we all kind of want the same things. We all want to deal with the death and disease caused by the global epidemic of smoking. So when I refer to the international tobacco control community or the international tobacco establishment, what I'm specifically referring to are those well-placed and well-funded elements who are implacably opposed to tobacco harm reduction and the use of safer products, and see no role for them in being part of this solution. So that's just a little caveat. So, in 1997, the Global Burden of Disease report estimated that around 3 million people were dying annually from smoking use, and projected a sharp increase in the years to come. And sadly, that report was proved correct. 5 million by 2002, at which point the WHO projected deaths at around 8 million by 2030. But we're already there. In 2001, Professor Richard Pato, who's a leading expert on tobacco mortality, estimated 1 billion lives by 2100. And that forecast remains unchanged. And that same year, the US Institute of Medicine published Clearing the Smoke, the scientific base for tobacco harm reduction. And one of its main conclusions back then was that many of the diseases attributable to tobacco mortality could be reduced by reducing exposure to tobacco intoxicants. Now, that report and all those calculations for deaths preceded enactment of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in 2005 and the entirely separate launch of the WHO Empower monitoring programme in 2006. That's during that same year, and roughly in that same period, the first e-cigarettes arrived in the USA and in Europe, and ultimately fulfilled the promise of what was described in Clearing the Smoke. So what's actually been achieved since 2005, 2006? Even before this time, many high-income countries were seeing falling prevalence of smoking anyway, due to an emphasis on healthier lifestyles, mainly among the more well-off in society. But even now, in those countries, those higher-income countries, prevalence graphs are flattening out. In lower and middle-income countries, population growth could result in an underestimate of future global smoking-related mortality. So I think it's fair to say that whatever tobacco controls are in place across the world, they are simply not enough to put a significant dent in some of these really awful predictions. So how has the international tobacco control establishment reacted to what are manifest failing policies? In the interest of global public health, a sensible and pragmatic response would be to take seriously the opportunities offered by the advent of safer nicotine products, which now a welter of independent evidence shows they are substantially safer than smoking. They help current smokers both switch away from smoking and offer an off-ramp to cessation should they choose, while at the same time offering little risk to bystanders. So if you actually want to help smokers, that's what you do. Especially as the WHO admits that the weakest bit of the whole Empower programme is the O bit, which is offering help to smokers, where they admit that 70% of whom globally have no access to helping services. The truth is, to be honest, there is little evidence of concern for the plight of current smokers and the impact that smoking has on families and many marginalised and disadvantaged communities, including Indigenous groups and those with substance or mental health problems, whose smoking prevalence is sky high compared to many national norms. Buried in reports covering non-communicable diseases and sustainable growth development goals, there is a recognition of failing tobacco control policies. But for public and political consumption, the WHO choose to trumpet that Empower reveals 5.3 billion people protected or covered by tobacco control policies. So the question is how come we still have 8 million people dying every year from tobacco-related diseases? And an unchanged forecast going back to 2001. As far as I'm concerned, Empower is nothing more than a tick box exercise focused on passing laws which in many countries are unenforceable, either through a lack of resources or a lack of sustained political will. Far worse, though, is the well-organised and well-funded Western-backed attempts to interfere with LMIC tobacco control policies, urging governments, and in some cases bribing them, to ban all safer nicotine products. A key weapon in the armoury is the promulgation, especially through reports and papers presented to the Framework Convention Conference of the Parties, a promulgation of a disgraceful and distortion of evidence based on demonstrably flawed science. In the face of failing traditional policies and the growing evidence in favour of tobacco harm reduction, the WHO, the FCT Secretariat and NGO allies, backed by millions of Bloomberg dollars, are deflecting attention by fighting the last war against the tobacco industry, alleging that the whole safer nicotine product phenomenon is just the industry up to its old tricks again. This may re-energise the tired old tobacco warriors of the 1980s and 90s and keep people in their well-paid jobs, but it is a crime against 1 billion smokers, 50% of whom are going to die. This is the tragic lesson of history, when generals and military strategists fail through ignorance or refuse through hubris to take account of changing circumstances, dig themselves ever deeper trenches, leaving those in the firing line, in the front line, to pay the price. This report contends that the international tobacco control establishment is actually out of control, that the FCTC Secretariat has been allowed to become a runaway train of misinformation and misdirection, diametrically opposed to the best interests of global public health. It is time for a course correction. It is time for those parties to the convention who fund the FCT and the conference out of taxpayers' money to take back control of the FCTC and steer away from a self-defeating prohibition program, which now has nicotine itself squarely in the crosshairs. So what does taking back control look like? Harm reduction is mentioned in Article 1D of the FCTC, covering the definition of tobacco control, but it's not clearly defined. Yet at the time of the FCTC negotiations in the early 2000s, the term was perfectly understood by the WHO and the wider global clinical and public health community as it referred to reducing the risk of contracting HIV through unprotected sex or sharing injecting equipment. Where implemented, harm reduction policies saw significant falls in rates of infection. To put it simply, harm reduction works. There now needs to be a COP working party on tobacco harm reduction to examine all, and I repeat all, the available evidence relating to safer nicotine products, not just the material pumped out by hand-picked WHO experts who studiously ignore the inconvenient evidence about the game-changing potential of safer nicotine products. The level of paranoia and secrecy which attends the Conference of the Parties itself would not be acceptable in many other international fora. Key stakeholders are deliberately excluded from COP proceedings. Now, I've watched The West Wing more than once, and as far as I can tell, the COP is not the Situation Room in the White House. And to eject stakeholders and media from the conference is an affront to the democratic process. By contrast, the forthcoming COP on climate change will admit representatives from business and industry, agriculture, labour unions, indigenous populations, environmental groups, the list goes on. The so-called justification for this totalitarian state of affairs is Article 5.3 of the Convention and its attendant guidelines. Or rather, I should say, an over-interpretation of those instruments. Neither was meant to exclude the industry, large or small, from being part of the solution. The primary intention of both was to ensure that any engagement between industry and government was open and transparent, and that industry should not be allowed to over-influence tobacco control policies. But what has happened is that the guidelines in particular have been used not only to undermine the democratic process of the COP, but has extended beyond the COP, used by the tobacco control establishment to slander, libel, exclude and threaten tobacco harm reduction activists and academics and clinicians working in support of tobacco harm reduction. The tobacco control establishment now has all the appearance of a religious cult. Secrecy, paranoia, personal attacks, and increasingly desperate distortion of the evidence as it realises that it is now on the wrong side of history. That from nowhere in 2006, there are now around 100 million global users of safer nicotine products. Life was so much simpler back in the 1980s and 90s. There were anti-smoking NGOs and the public and medical community lined up against the tobacco industry. The Fctc aimed to assist especially lower and middle income countries to develop tobacco control policies through guidance and support in a clear division between the availability of dangerous products and a government's duty to protect its citizens. Back then, no man's land didn't exist. I could say these days that the battle lines are far more blurred, but actually there shouldn't be any battle lines. In a debate about climate change, everyone is part of the solution, including oil, energy and mining companies, as well as environmental groups. What we need now is tobacco control is for all the stakeholders to have a seat at the table, including industry and consumers working together to preside over the dying embers of combustion and not allow a tobacco control theocracy to continue adding fuel to the flames of a new war against nicotine. We are experiencing tsunamis of misinformation, hurricanes of paranoia, and global storms of hot air. What we need now, in our world at least, is climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. I appreciated your dissection of Empower and your depiction of the cult-like establishment among much else. And don't forget that you'll all have the opportunity to ask Harry and the others questions later on, and if you're online, you can be sending questions in already. We'll turn now to Dr. Derek Yuck. Derek is a global health advocate of over 30 years' experience. He was previously, of course, the founding executive director of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Before that, at the WHO itself, he was cabinet director and executive director for non-communicable diseases and mental health, in which capacity he was deeply involved in the development of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Derek has also authored over 250 peer-reviewed articles, served on numerous prestigious advisory boards, among other accolades too numerous to mention. And Derek's going to be talking to us today about the origins and decline of the Fctc. Thank you, Derek.
Thanks, and a real privilege to be with you all today, and let me commend particularly KAC, Jerry and Harry for the incredible leadership that they've provided in getting the kind of material, the kind of mobilization that we now have, that is one of the few serious counters to some of the stuff we're seeing coming out of WHO and Bloomberg-funded entities. So, I was reflecting, what do I really have to offer? And I think often just a little bit of a historical background may help people fill in some gaps that they may not be aware of. And I lived a lot of them, so I know what was actually happening in some of the periods. Not all. I was too young for the 1962 report of the Royal College of Physicians that actually started it all. But let me go back to 1970. 1970 was a very important year. It was the very first time that a resolution came to the floor of the World Health Organization where it had wording saying that smoking kills and action is needed. It was based really on two major international reports, the Royal College of Physicians report of 1962 and the Surgeon General's report of 1964. And remember, both of those reports were led by doctor-based organizations. It was the Royal College of Physicians from this country that was the very first call for serious international action. And I'm going to come back to that all these years later. Very interestingly, the resolution, there was a bit of a debate and it passed, and an advisory board was set up. And most of the members, in fact, all of them, have sadly died. One of the original members of that task force is alive and at 90, still active. Many of you know him, Lars Ramstam, the person who almost single-handedly has carried the banner for one of the key components of reduced risk, namely SNUS, over the decades, often at considerable critique, and finally to be vindicated when the FDA authorized generalized SNUS as being appropriate for the protection of public health. Mea culpa, during the years I was at WHO, and he and the Swedes would come and bring their data, we said, well, this is just industry stuff, must be dismissed. Well, since that very first resolution, there were many resolutions. In fact, in the content areas of WHO, there are very few areas where you've had as many resolutions on a topic as you have for tobacco control. And they were slowly building the basis of what became the components of the Framework Convention. So after a few years, you had one on advertising and efforts to try and ban advertising. You had others looking at smoke-free public places. You had focusing on kids and children. You had issues related to taxation and what was the appropriate approach going forward. I think what was interesting is that over those many years, it was 25 years, there was a slow build-up among governments that this was in fact an important public health issue. And remember that for the world, the dominant issues they thought were mainly infectious diseases or issues related to undernutrition and hunger. There was virtually no interest or support for serious chronic diseases and their determinants. Things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, mental health, chronic lung diseases were not a priority, whereas measles, tuberculosis, undernutrition, and so on were the priorities. And in many reasons, that was probably right, because that is what we were seeing the epidemiology drive deaths and disease, particularly in the low middle income countries. But tobacco led the way in saying that this next set of decades is going to be one dominated by chronic diseases. And the number one risk factor, tobacco, better be top of our list. Over that period, there were a few governments who showed leadership right from the beginning. And they included the United Kingdom, they included Norway, they included Canada. And I mention them because people often don't realize that without the support of the Canadian government, there probably would be no framework convention. It was the Canadian government that provided the support to the WHO to have the staffing, to do the analytic work, to originally have some of the stuff. And of course, the other interesting thing is that the governments who pushed hardest for regulations and legislation were those that had the best regulatory capacity to enforce them. And if I was to say, looking back, the one error that we all made was not to think more deeply about how does this piece of legislation or regulation work in a low middle income countries? Was there an explicit focus on saying, if you ban sales to children, but children are selling to children in low middle income countries, how on earth is that going to be enforceable? Or how are you going to enforce many of the tax desires in a country where there is zero capacity for addressing illicit trade or customs strength? That was never an issue within WHO. The thought about the implementation problems was put on the governments, and hopefully somehow miraculously they would deal with them. They were never funded to do it. And that's why we are at the position we get to today. So this build-up happened. By 1998, the start of the negotiations happened. And I would say that one of the biggest things that if we look back to 1998 that was interesting is that we led the negotiations by bringing the tobacco industry into the hallowed halls of WHO to ask the scientists what did they think they would have in their armamentarium to address harm reduction and the product itself. So we had BAT, Philip Morris, one or two other companies, JT, actually present, can you imagine this, in a WHO building to WHO officials plus external consultants on the record And their presentations were what they were at the time, 20 years ago. They were not too impressive. The level of science hadn't developed. And our view was really to listen to them, to say, well, that's the last time we listened to them, and that's what happened. And WHO walked away from the potential to say maybe the innovation cycle was going to continue. If you fast forward to where we are now, we have colleagues, Roya Gahali, out of a program out of Oxford, a leading patent attorney and lawyer, has put out a report showing that in the last decade, 75,000 patents have been filed in the area of reduced risk products, most of them related to harm reduction products that form the components of e-cigarettes or heated tobacco products. And some of them even going further, looking at adjacent uses for nicotine or for the heating devices to improve public health and medicine. Despite all that, if you read the text, the word patent and intellectual property does not exist once in the structure of the Framework Convention. At exactly the same time that was being negotiated, the hottest issue in Geneva was patents and intellectual property related to HIV/AIDS drugs, where the WTO was in a major battle with a number of the companies, and my own country at the time, South Africa and Brazil, were pushing hard to actually make sure that access to science and technology would save lives, and eventually that won out. How is it possible that we were so blinkered? And the reason is because we never in our wildest dreams imagined that true innovation, transformation of the core product that was killing, would actually be transformed through science, technology, and innovation to no longer kill and held the potential to accelerate an end to smoking. If we jump to 2005, by 2005 the treaty was adopted. 180 countries signed on very quickly. And I went back to my comments I made at an SR&T meeting in Prague that year, where I was asked, so what do you think the road ahead is going to be? And I really raised three concerns. One was complacency, that the energy and the excitement, difficult to imagine, around building a treaty, getting text, and some of you in the audience were there with us in different ways, would dissipate fast. And instead, a bureaucracy would take over, a bureaucratic mindset would take over, the passion would be gone, the focus on people, on smokers, the focus on cancer, heart disease, and many of the actual diseases would actually would disappear, and the vague term tobacco control would take over. The whole purpose of the Framework Convention is to prevent diseases and death, specific diseases, specific causes of deaths, but we don't talk about those anymore. And what happened is the American Cancer Society went quiet and sort of walked away. The American Heart Association didn't really do much more because they didn't feel they were part of the objective. So the first thing I said was complacency, and I fear that did set in. And 15 years later, we see the signs of it. Secondly, I raised the fact that by 2005, we were starting to see the emergence of what could be harm reduction products which could save lives. We needed to keep our eye on the ball. We needed to engage with that community, regardless of where the science was coming from. And I didn't really know much about it, and made the comment, wrote about it, and went on with my life. The third one was there would be no progress without serious money and investment by low middle income countries and by the international development community into tobacco control. That never happened. I would say, luckily, and I mean it sincerely, Bloomberg did come up with a lot of money for some of the elements, and I think for that, you've got to actually praise him, that through the Bloomberg philanthropy, you probably have more activity in a number of countries related to taxation, even though the progress has been incredibly slow and bad, raising awareness, putting tobacco on the map. None of that would happen if they didn't have the dollars. The problem was the enormous damaging blind spot on the tools and the means to end the actual killing and the deaths. So let's jump to 2015, which was the next year of significance to me. And in 2015, I was asked by Spectator Health here in the UK to write a piece on what was going on in the e-cigarette world. I was at a group called Vitality, who many of you in the UK will know. It gets you active and incentivizes healthy behavior, and it's a great dachshund to try and persuade you to join the cause. And we were not making progress enough on tobacco, doing well on activity. So I undertook the challenge and reviewed the evidence, and I was shocked that I'd walked away, I'd been out of tobacco control intensively for a decade, and what had happened was millions of people were using e-cigarettes across Europe with great success. Snus, the data that we'd seen before, was starting to actually spread well beyond Sweden. The death rates were down. Swedish men were now dying by far at the lowest rate of cancers. And this all suggested that the harm reduction world was about to start seeing a dramatic increase in interest. Of course, I was late to the party. I had many colleagues, people like Clive Bates and Dylan Human and David Sweener, had been warning this was coming and we weren't paying enough attention. But most in public health dismissed all that. And that was the reason, that was the fundamental reason I went ahead with the foundation. It was because we never before had a technology opportunity to bring the deaths down. And I knew then that if we succeeded, we would actually make the biggest public health impact that we would ever be able to make in our lives. And who on earth would not want to be part of that? So we went ahead. And now let's jump to 2021 and where we are and where we go forward. First of all, one thing we all learned in the pandemic is to look at the projections. Every day these grim projections, the numbers have gone up, the deaths have gone up, and people didn't just talk about them. In some parts of the world, they actually looked at the projections and said, we better double down on masks and social distancing. We better increase our vaccine. There was action based on the projections. You heard what Harry said. 1 billion people are set to die this century if we continue with our trends. 8 million people are dying this year. The thing about tobacco control and the outcome is that it's much more secure to project future deaths because the epidemiology of what happens when you smoke and later die is pretty certain. So when you see projections, you better act on them. But where's the action? Oh, isn't it interesting? We have 8 million people dying this year, and if we continue, blah, 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 blah. Instead of saying, my God, we've got to reverse these trends. We've got to have greater passion, greater activity. And I think that, I hope, is the lesson that people take from the report, that the chance to act remains here, but the results will only be seen 15, 20 years from now, which means we have to tolerate delayed satisfaction in this game compared to COVID, where you see the changes almost overnight. So what are the positive signs? I think the Royal College of Physicians report this year, going back to it, all those decades later, is now leading the world with physicians saying use e-cigarettes as part of your armamentarium. The commonest way people are quitting is through e-cigarettes. Use them, and I'm sure that when they look at the other opportunities, they will see the same. That message needs to be globalized. Nowhere in the world do you see the smoking rate go down among the general population before it first goes down among the doctors. And the gap is usually a decade. Nowhere in the world. Look at China. The smoking rate among doctors is 50%. The smoking rate in men is 50%. In Indonesia, the figures are 60, 65% for both. If the doctors don't lead, the population will not follow, the population will not act. We have forgotten about the doctors. We've forgotten about their leadership. They played decisive roles before, and they need to return to that role. Second, the FDA. I'm sitting in the UK. The FDA still matters. It's probably the most powerful regulatory science body we have on the planet. It's something we look to for pharmaceutical decisions, for drug decisions, for medical device. I sat on some of their global food safety. We know that their global safety standards become the global norm. There are virtually no examples of an FDA decision that does not become the global norm. There are one or two, but they're peculiar. So the question is, how long will it take for the US government to actually talk more rigorously and vigorously about the authorizations they've had for snus, for VUs, and for IQOS, all authorized as appropriate for the protection of public health? Usually what happens is the US government makes a decision, it authorizes its embassies to actually get out and tell and explain to the people in country why they made this decision. What is the underlying science? What's the benefit to the population? They should be proud of it. It's a fantastic decision. Don't let it sit in the US and fester. Let it become part of the global debate and the global norm. Combine that with the Royal College of Physicians report and the Doctor's Voice of the UK, and you have two incredibly important countries respected around the world in a position to actually influence the debate. On the user side, as Harry said, Never before did we think we'd have 100 million people using the range of products, from snus to heated tobacco products to e-cigarettes and a wide range of other vapes. Their voice clearly needs to be more activated and allowed to be present. Remember what we learned from HIV/AIDS. It was when the patients and the people who had AIDS who spoke up and organized and said, nothing for us without us, action followed. That's starting to be said in this community, but I don't see the passion, I don't see the organized focus and discussion yet, because those voices have been so dampened down, the smoker has been so stigmatized, the smoker has been so excluded from the debate, deliberately expunged from the debate, that they no longer seem that they have a voice. And then on to the companies. We are so cautious and careful about saying, we don't talk about company X, Y, and Z, and you don't want to. Well, let's just take one very quick look, and I'm nearly there, Will. To take one quick look at the internal combustion engine debate. What's going on there? You have President Xi of China saying he wants to end the sale of the internal combustion engine, I think he said within a decade. You have President Biden making similar comments about where he wants the US to be 15 years from now. Of course, China can do a lot by control. The US has got to stimulate market forces. What are the companies doing? Well, many of them are way out front. If you've got companies like Swedish Match getting 40% of their revenue from reduced risk products, PMI is now at 30%, BAT is at 12%, that's a pretty good starting point from zero not too long ago. Why aren't we getting out there and saying they are the equivalent of Ford and General Motors and Volvo, all actually saying we want to end the internal combustion engine? And what is happening to them? Governments adjust their regulations to make it easier for them to actually get out and make it easier for consumers to buy these products. But that isn't all. We have the equivalent of Teslas. We all praise Teslas doing a fantastic job, but nobody says Tesla should be given even more praise than GM getting out of internal combustion engine. Tesla's been on the front end, but it's no longer the largest contributor to reduced risk products. So who are the Teslas? Smur, a country coming out of China at us around the world with a market capitalization far greater than Juul. Most people never talks about them. Relax, another company based out of Singapore. And of course, Juul. And remember, between them, initially, none of them had any tobacco industry ties. Juul, of course, does. The other two don't. But is that the point? The point is they are leading the way out of combustibles with products, with marketing, with strategies. Surely the government should say, let's make it easier for them. And the way to do it is to make sure that you have your regulations proportionate to the risk of the product, something I think we'll talk about lastly. So let me just end by saying, when I look forward, I hope that we recognize that this will be a holding year. The best that can be achieved at COP9 is not much. We hope it's a year of relative silence. It's a year of a lot of noting and nodding, but it's a year when the member states finally start seeing that if you've got 100 million users, if you've got FDA authorizations all over the place and many more to come, if you've got the Royal College of Physicians and doctors starting to see it, if you've got the distortion on the knowledge of nicotine that you have, surely the time's come to change course and actually address what could be preventing the largest cause of death in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. A great deal to unpack there. I appreciated your industry analysis and also your insider's perspective of the evolution of this whole thing, including some startling omissions at different points, such as adequate consideration of implications in LMICs, patents, doctors, and I must admit I didn't know how much of the origins of this that should be laid at Canada's feet. But finally, questions for Derek, of course, welcome very soon. Finally, we're going to turn to Tom Gleeson, who is a trustee of New Nicotine Ireland, NNA Ireland, where he and his colleagues work to give a voice to people who are too often denied it. And like many advocates in this field, Tom has personally benefited from tobacco harm reduction as formerly a heavy smoker, and I believe 11 years ago tried e-cigarettes and was able to switch entirely within days, which is Absolutely incredible. Delighted to welcome you, Tom. And Tom is going to be giving a talk titled Our Health, Consumers, the Often Forgotten Majority.
Hello, everyone. Like Harry, I'm going to take advantage of the distance here. For the ordinary person, whenever we hear discussions on safer nicotine products, e-cigarettes, new and novel nicotine products, whatever term they use, we hear from tobacco control. We hear from the Cancer Society, retailers' associations. Who we don't hear from are the consumers themselves. Well, they'll be mentioned. Sometimes they're referred to as people, though they avoid that. People humanizes them. People have families. People have hobbies. People have cares and worries. Consumers are faceless economic units. Consumers can be presented as the passive victims of the manipulations of big tobacco, as aggressive polluters of non-smokers' clean air, or as astroturf for the tobacco industry, but never as political equals whose rights should be respected. A consumer can, indeed must, be ignored. This is an established strategy to delegitimize consumers and keep them out of the discussion. Consumers are a prop, an example of the evils of tobacco when we end up in hospital, aggregated into a statistic to be weighted on the death side of the tobacco scales. The tobacco industry has been just as patronizing. As we've seen in the frank statement to tobacco smokers, they, like tobacco control, had our best interests at heart. Neither side saw us as people with something to contribute. We were to be acted upon for our own good. But we are not passive victims or stooges. We are the people who created this opportunity. When e-cigarettes first came to the market, they were facsimiles of combustible products, plastic cigarettes with an LED on the end. What we have today has no resemblance to those early products. And that evolution happened because the people who used them took the idea and developed it. People like Matt and Ted Rogers, 20-a-day smokers who needed an e-cigarette with a much longer battery life. They modified a torch and created the first mod. Someone else put a cartomizer in a hacked syringe and created the first tank system. The e-cigarette we have now, we have because users changed it to suit their needs. We started online forums to share our experiences and support each other. We came together for meetups, which grew into vape fests, an enjoyable mix of trade show, fan convention, and cessation clinic. We opened stores and spread the word on safer nicotine products. Never before has means of quitting smoking gained such support from its users. From these online forums and real-life get-togethers came consumer organizations set up to promote tobacco harm reduction and advocate for safer nicotine products and the people who use them. There are now advocacy organizations in the UK, Sweden, Ireland, Australia, France, Mexico, the Philippines. There are over 50 consumer-led groups worldwide representing the rights of both the consumers of safer nicotine products and the rights of smokers to access safer nicotine products. That's over 1 billion people. Yet we're excluded. Potentially the greatest resource available to tobacco control, a grassroots movement of people who have quit smoking, is ignored. We're the people with the lived experience of switching. We're the ones whose testimonies of quitting smoking. We're the ones who improved our own health. We achieved what the Fctc didn't think was possible. We stopped smoking and improved our health prospects without abstinence from nicotine. We might not be as pious as if we had embraced abstinence, but we are happier, healthier, and wealthier than if we had continued smoking. We're the evidence that harm reduction works. Tobacco control's total rejection of the tobacco industry has only served to marginalise the development of harm reduction. The industry research on these products is excluded, and all that data and evidence is lost to them. Furthermore, without the oversight of those regulatory bodies, there's a risk of repeating the light cigarettes fiasco, and a risk of missing a vital opportunity to reduce harm. But those seem to be risks they're willing to take with our lives. It's not without irony that the International Atomic Energy Agency has more say in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control than the people who use tobacco products or advocate on their behalf. Today's report is titled Fighting the Last War. Sun Tzu in The Art of War wrote, "Do not repeat the tactics which have gained you one victory, but let your methods be regulated by the infinite variety of circumstances." In the war on tobacco, the circumstances have changed infinitely, yet its leaders still cling to what gave them that one victory. Tobacco control to be most effective must encompass regulators, manufacturers, and consumers. All can and must make a contribution to reducing the toll on health and well-being that comes from combustible tobacco. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights states that the right to health encapsulates, this is long, a right to control one's health and body, guaranteeing the enjoyment of a variety of facilities, goods, services, and conditions necessary for the realization of the highest attainable standard of health. That's what harm reduction is. If we accept the right to health as a right that enhances autonomy and human dignity, we must prioritize interventions most likely to increase the autonomy of those least able to achieve it without outside help. Harm reduction may increase the number of users at a population level, but that's not a basis upon which a human rights approach should be judged. The right to health focuses on an autonomous individual. Harm reduction will probably not be the magic bullet to end tobacco-related mortality and morbidity, but it can be a synergistic complement to other tobacco control measures. Unlike current efforts, we don't need to do anything to introduce a harm reduction strategy. Private enterprise is already providing the products. People themselves are spreading the word and encouraging each other. Instead of hindering this, national and international policymakers should engage with harm reduction. With appropriate regulation, the products and the consumers will do the rest. A consumer's voice matters, and it makes the difference. When the TPD was being revised, the intention was to regulate safer nicotine products as medicines. We campaigned against this, and the TPD is now a set of regulations much more fitted to the products and protecting the health of the people who use them. There was no EVALI outbreak in the EU. You're welcome. This should serve as a template for others to follow. But the war on tobacco is never ending, and those opposed to harm reduction are still attempting to restrict safer nicotine products and stifle the progress we've made. We must speak up. We must tell people about what we do, who we are, and why we do it. We must unite and support each other. We must let the regulators and the legislators know that we will not be excluded. They may ignore us, but we will not be silent. We cannot let them forget that this is about us, about our health, our choices, and our lives. To borrow a phrase, there can be nothing about us without us. Thank you. Sure, before I fall.
Well said, Tom. Thank you very much for that description, reminding us of the extent to which tobacco harm reduction is a movement driven by people who use nicotine, and of how, for all forms of harm reduction, an absolutely key component is the agency, not only the agency, but the leadership of people who are directly impacted. Well, we've heard three really thought-provoking talks, and I'd like to move straight on. Luckily, we've got plenty of time left for questions. I've got some online questions piling up here, so I'll start with one of those, but then those of you in the room can please get your hands up straight after that. So I'll turn to the first one. Most of these can be answered by anyone. Some are addressed to an individual. But Richard Pruin asks, how can the UK, as one of the major funders of the Fctc, take back control? Won't they find it an uphill struggle without support? Would anyone like to take that? Derek, perhaps?
I've always been amazed that governments who have the commitment to do something can do it. Now, the UK is uniquely placed in a number of ways. First, it is a major funder. So it's got the leverage of its funding. Second, it's got a track record, second to none. It is the global leader, and it needs to act like the global leader and share that. Thirdly, it plays a central role in the Commonwealth. And within all the WHO structures, many people don't know, but the Commonwealth countries, the old Commonwealth, and praise the Queen for that, actually still have a political connection and link. So there's a natural affinity to the 40-plus countries that meet every time there's a major WHO meeting and try and get a Commonwealth alignment. Where are the efforts, maybe they exist, to actually discuss within the Commonwealth structures the UK approach as being the way forward, since it is based the most on the science, it's led by the doctors, it's having an impact in the population. The numbers are showing that. So there are many opportunities. And the question is there the political will and leadership to do that? Is this a topic that's risen high enough within the global health arena? And I do fear that the reality of the pandemic has meant that 99% of leading governments are going to be devoted to putting their energy behind the pandemic. But here's an opportunity for, in the post-Brexit era, for the UK to show a very different type of leadership in the global sphere, where it's credible, it's aligned with their background, it's aligned with their data.
Thank you, Derek. Do we have any questions in the room right now? Anyone want to ask one? I'll turn to another online one next then. So we have one from Nicholas Nanawashvili. I'm really sorry if I mispronounced that. We often hear skepticism and distrust from WHO and anti-tobacco NGOs about researches on heated tobacco products. Why do you think WHO does not conduct its independent research?
I mean, you've only got to look at the WHO TOB Reg report, Tobacco Regulation Report, great big fat report, about 300 pages of it, which completely ignores any of the evidence in support of tobacco harm reduction and its potential benefits, and in fact goes out of its way at various points in the report to kind of denigrate, puts tobacco harm reduction in inverted commas and talks about so-called tobacco harm reductions. And also had a pop at PMI calling their IQOS boutiques swanky in one bit, which is not really the scientific language you expect in a report like that. So I don't think there's any desire, motivation, political will, whatever you want to call it, because if the WHO wanted to actually produce an entirely independent report about this, it would be calling upon all the evidence that is out there, is a point I made in my speech. And I remember from one of the pre-COP, I can't remember which COP it was, COP 6, COP 7, they produced a paper for the conference which made it absolutely clear that medicinal use of nicotine, as in nicotine replacement therapy, was acceptable. Recreational use of nicotine was not acceptable, and it was quite clear in that report. So it comes as no surprise to me that because the whole thing is driven by moral ideology, I can't think of any other kind of phrase to describe this, a complete refusal to acknowledge the potential public health benefits of something which can complement tobacco control. I mean, the advocates for tobacco harm reduction have never said, well, we need to scrap everything else and just focus on safer nicotine products. Nobody's ever said that. It's a complementary process, a complementary intervention, which WHO don't, and there's a lot of deflection. There's a lot of deflection going on. I mean, the whole thrust of what we hear these days is essentially, what about the kids? You know, and they talk about EVALI, and they talk about nicotine addiction and brain problems for young kids who vape. And my answer to that little bit is, well, if there was developmental problems with nicotine for young people, I think after about, decades and decades of tobacco research, it might actually have been revealed by now that
well said.
young people who smoke, can't add up, or whatever they seem to think is happening.
Derek, you wanted to briefly weigh in on that one.
Yeah, so I think people often don't realize WHO actually doesn't do very much research. It's not set up to do it. There are a few areas it does, tropical disease research being one, human and reproductive health was another. But what it does do, and it is mandated to do, is to set research priorities for the world. And in the Framework Convention, there are at least 3 major provisions calling for the development of an accepted set of research priorities to accelerate, in whatever words you want to use it, I would use the word end to smoking. They have not executed on that, so there is no approved list. Because that then gets picked up. And let me tell you what happened right in the beginning of the Framework Convention. I know because I convened with Richard Peto from here, John Samet, who's been on every Surgeon General Committee, a group of people. We convened groups to ask the question, what should the research priorities for tobacco control in general be? And put out a report. But we knew that it would have no teeth if there wasn't a major funding body who'd pick it up. And at the time, the NIH, the Fogarty Center, the International Center, picked it up and created for several years what became virtually the only accepted international tobacco research program addressing low-middle income countries in the basics of tobacco control, basic surveillance, basic data collection, very simple but very important things that every country needs to do. I would have hoped by now there'd be an update on that, but there hasn't been. So in the absence, I would say that in answer to the question, number one, the Framework Convention needs to actually get on and produce that priority list. Second, they need to draw upon the enormous funding of the NIH, because it is the largest funder by far in this field, to do what they did in the past and get behind whatever the decisions are. And if one of the research priorities is how do reduced risk products lead to improved public health? What are the untoward effects? Are there gateway approaches? Those are all fine questions to ask, but get them funded with the full support of WHO, and whatever the results are, they need to act upon them, which is the way they do it on vaccines and everything else. Can you imagine if WHO excluded the FDA decisions that we had in the last few months on the Moderna virus vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, which sit now at the core of our protection? Of course, you'd think that's absurd. But have you seen a WHO report acknowledging the FDA authorizations of snus, IQOS, and VUs? How is it possible that you can accept one part of the FDA's decision for global norm creation and not the other? That's something people have got to ask.
Great point. Thank you. I think we had a question in the room. Paddy Costall of KAC there.
Thanks, Will. Is this on?
Yes.
It's on, yeah?
Yes.
Just something which I hope is timely and appropriate, but in approximately 30 minutes' time, the Chancellor of the Exchequer for the UK is going to deliver his budget speech in Parliament, which is going to determine expenditure, fiscal arrangements, etc. for the next 12 months. And I wonder what each of the panellists might like to see Mr. Sunak say in relation to tobacco regulation and taxation.
Thanks, Paddy. Tom, would you like to start? I don't know if you want to comment on the Chancellor, but just your thoughts about taxation and its impact, taxation relative of reduced risk products and tobacco, and its impact on the consumer.
Yeah. The thing is, taxation actually works to reduce smoking. But it's reached a point now where diminishing returns are setting in. You're punishing the smoker. You're not just giving him a strong hint that he shouldn't smoke. You're actually punishing him every time. That's maybe we've reached the end for the capabilities of taxation, certainly in the Western world, in developed countries, to do what it's intended to do. All it does at this stage is drive people to the black market. It's further evidence that we need another string to the bow. I'm kind of hoping he puts nothing on him, but you know.
Yes. Thanks, Tom. Would you broadly agree with that, Derek?
I don't have a strong view, so maybe Harry could.
Yeah.
I have even less a strong view. I don't actually know. I mean, we've kind of trumpeted the UK as a kind of leader in the public health, and I think it's probably true. But it would be helpful if and I'm not even sure this is particularly related to taxation, although I would say that and I'm no expert on this at all, but you really want to put as much space between the product availability and cost and accessibility of safer nicotine products as opposed to cigarettes. So you need what I assume would be an ever-widening gap to make these products acceptable. But I think there's a much wider issue here about kind of having the support of government in encouraging people to switch away. And I'm not sure there really is. I mean, we know Public Health England reports, Royal College of Physicians reports, but it still doesn't appear to be a kind of getting out into the general public. I mean, we've still got a significant number of health professionals, GPs that Derek mentioned, who still think that nicotine causes cancer and all the rest of it. So I think maybe if you're looking to put some more cash into public health, that there may be some attempt to make the advantages of safer nicotine products more available, more accessible, and get those messages out. And I mean, the government's been, for the past 18 months, all we've had is like daily press releases, press conferences, press briefings about, sloganising how we deal with COVID, safe space, wear your mask, protect the NHS, save lives, and all of that kind of public health messaging has been going on around the virus. It would be nice to see some financial effort put into doing the same kind of thing for tobacco harm reduction and the advantages that can bring for people who currently smoke.
Thank you, Harry. We'll keep moving through as many questions as we can in the time remaining. I see there's another couple in the audience, but I'll take another online one first. Again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing, but Monica Gorgulio asks, possibly a leading question here, how ethical do you all believe it is when someone puts a huge amount of money to WHO demanding just one approach to deal with a serious public health problem like smoking? Can't think who she might mean.
No. I mean, the one thing when we talked about secrecy and lack of transparency and all the rest of it, I mean, I know sort of Bloomberg put something like $160 million or something into the USA campaign against flavours, but exactly what percentage of Bloomberg funding actually goes to what you might call traditional mainstream tobacco control, and what actually goes into the fight against tobacco harm reduction? I personally don't know, and it's quite opaque, and you can only delve so far into their accounts and things to see exactly how the money is being spent. So I suppose that, and as Derek said, Bloomberg has been putting money into mainstream tobacco control efforts, not tremendously successfully, but the money's been used. The trouble is that the impression you get, because of the fact that WHO and Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the Union and all those organisations go front and centre on anti-tobacco harm reduction. It gives the impression that the majority of all these millions of dollars is actually being spent trying to curb tobacco harm reduction and the products that go with it. And it may be true. Derek's also made the point that if Bloomberg wasn't putting money into this, then you wouldn't be getting there wouldn't be any tobacco control money going into WHO much at all, because I think my impression is that once the Fctc was done and dusted and all these various countries signed up, that was it. They signed a piece of paper and didn't really do much else. And that, I mean, Empower was a Bloomberg initiative. I don't think it came from the from the TFI. Yeah. You know, I think, you know, WHO have supped with the devil, and I don't think there's much doubt about that when it comes to tobacco harm reduction. But some of those funds, I assume, are being used for what we might call more ethical reasons. But because you can't get under the surface of what's going on, it's really difficult to make much more of a comment than that, I would think.
Derek, do you have any brief thoughts to add regarding Bloomberg funding and ethics or lack thereof?
Yeah, I think the general concern at WHO has always been about the role of non-government players in funding programs. And there've been a rise. It started with Gates becoming a very significant player, and of course Bloomberg in some of these areas, particularly tobacco, but also motor safety. The question that the member states have got to ask is this distorting an agenda that they've agreed upon among member states, because it is a member state-driven organization. And at this stage, it's unclear. It may very well be currently there's a sort of a synergy. The member states are kind of supportive of clamping down on harm reduction, unfortunately. And so the money supports them, and they support getting the money. And they're getting a lot of money at the country level for stuff. And they're getting it as well for tobacco control stuff. Many governments should be funding themselves, basically. But if you've got a big donor out there, they'll do it. So the critical question, it's less an ethical question, is the funding distorting what the member states want to do, yes or no? Which reminds us as well that when we use the term WHO, you've always got to remember it's a member state-owned organization. So if you point your finger at WHO, you've got to start off by pointing your finger at the member states who make the decisions for WHO. Now, it is certainly the case that the issue of tobacco control has slumped pretty far down the list of priorities for member states in this pandemic period, and even before with many of the other concerns. But you can't get away with saying, well, if you're already worried about WHO in every country, you should ask your government, what is your position when you go to the WHO meetings? Because every single individual member state has an opportunity to change WHO policy. Every single one, because so much is done by consensus.
Thank you, Derek. Let's take one from the room next. I'm not sure who was next. We had one at the front. We'll take, Sud, if you could just introduce yourself before asking your question. Thank you.
Sure. I'm Sud Patwardhan, Director for Centre for Health Research and Education based in the UK. First of all, congratulations to Harry and team for doing an excellent report. And it's good to see that you mention in the report, as well as in what you mentioned just now about the nicotine illiteracy among the broader population, but also healthcare professionals. If I was to offer a kind of an example of where we think we can make some progress in converting what sounds like good policy in the UK and even at the WHO level, with the fact that nicotine replacement therapy is on the model essential list of the WHO. I think what we've seen, Harry, and I hope that that is captured in your future reports, is that in the UK and in India, where we have the same level of nicotine illiteracy, the effort we are doing with healthcare professionals seems to give some promise to us. In the UK itself, we have worked with the largest mental health private provider, and there are about 4,000 healthcare professionals at the coalface now in the UK who have gone through what I would call THR literacy training, and they are nicotine literate, I would say, at least for this year, and they'll go back to another CME next year. But the big problem, and I would love to hear your thoughts, all of you at the panel, is healthcare professionals' education does not include nicotine and tobacco harm reduction. I went into medical school and came out just knowing that tobacco causes cancer, and tobacco, cigarettes, smoking, everything was lumped into one. And if it was not for my time over the last few decades in this area, I wouldn't be any more enlightened. And this is the biggest challenge we face. And I don't think enough is done, apart from some of the work we're doing in India and the UK, on actually busting some of these myths. Thoughts?
Thank you, Sud. Let's turn to Tom first. That sounds a fantastic project, by the way, and the nicotine illiteracy in doctors and healthcare workers that Sud referenced. I just wondered whether you or your consumer advocate allies have had sort of direct experience of that.
Yeah, it's a hurdle. Nicotine is guilty by association as much as anything else. And it's almost become a synonym for tobacco, for smoking. Unfortunately, it's nicotine, and they have been well able to play on the teen end of the word in every advertising campaign. So fair play to them. It's hard to resist a pun like that. But it's left people with the impression that the smoke doesn't matter. The smoke isn't the problem. But we still have chimneys in our houses. It should clue them in. The smoke is the part that kills people. The smoke is the part that causes the diseases. How you re-get the focus back there, I have no idea. I have no idea if the people who technically fight the diseases are even willing to do that. Yeah. They seem to be quite happy to eliminate nicotine completely, rather than say, yeah, the nicotine is fine. Which is odd, because on the other hand, there's a much more liberal approach to cannabis, even smoked. Figure it out.
Yeah. I'm going to keep this rolling because I want to try to get through as many questions as we can with time a little short. But a gentleman in the front here who's been waiting to ask his question. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but if you could introduce yourself and ask it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, my name is Tonnaar, Bas Tonnaar. I have a question to, well, all of you actually in front. The report is called Fighting the Last War. And I guess, you know, it's also a board from both sides, because tobacco harm reduction advocates are also not very happy with the current situation. We know COP9 is coming in 1.5 weeks. We don't expect much because most of the important decisions that have a relationship to tobacco harm reduction are being deferred to COP10, which will be in 2023. What would we see as a success in 2023 for COP10? But concretely, I mean, we obviously can't change the treaty. But what should we do, and what should we expect, and what should we consider a win?
Thank you. I'm going to put that one to Harry, because we have one for Derek coming up shortly. But Harry, from obviously being deeply immersed in this, what would you see as a win?
As I said in my speech, you know, it's all about course correction. It seems to me that if there was a way, and somebody asked a question about having UK support, and I think we already know that the UK at the moment is not in any mindset to start talking about tobacco harm reduction working party at COP. But I think between now and then, you know, success would be at least more countries beginning to question the information that they're being delivered from WHO, from the Secretariat. I mean, of course, the thing about COP is, of course, a lot of the decisions and discussions and debates go on well before anybody gets anywhere near the conference. But it would be, and Derek mentioned the importance of FDA decisions on all of this. And so I would hope to see a direction of travel towards a more kind of pragmatic response. And I think some of the actions of the anti-tobacco harm reduction groups and allies and funders do show an element of desperation. And I do think they probably think in some way they are losing the argument, and so resort to some of the tactics that we all know about in terms of trying to discredit the information and the people and all the rest of it. But as Derek said, it took from sort of 1970 to the kind of 90s for tobacco control and the problems that tobacco causes to begin to come up the political radar. I hope it doesn't take that long for things to be turned around to the way we want. But in the way that the technology has just taken off and the number of consumers have taken off since around 2006, there might be some hope that you can turn the oil tanker around in somewhat less time than we've experienced up to now.
Thank you, Harry. I'm going to get as quick as I can with the timings on these last ones, but another one that came in for Derek from Dorothy Aderman, saying, can the Fctc be revised to truly incorporate harm reduction in SMPs, or is it irrevocable? Work with what we've got and improve it, or tear it up and start again?
Yeah, I won't embarrass anybody in the room, but we have a world expert who did her PhD exactly on the topic of the Framework Convention and what can be revised and what can't be revised. And from my learning from her and others is that the text provides the leeway to do what we need to do. The definition includes harm reduction. All the provisions are general. The specifics go into the development of guidelines. So there are provisions on taxation. What we need are clear guidelines, which can be done without an amendment to the Constitution, saying, how do we adapt the regulatory guidelines in relation to harm reduction? And the answer should be by using the relative risks underlying the different products that we have. In other words, risk proportionate regulation. How do we, and it applies to the product regulations, it applies to the taxation, the education, and the information. So the answer is yes, with some creative thought, guidelines could be developed that would actually put teeth behind harm reduction in the very provisions where they need to be. So you clearly got to distinguish between a harm reduction product in the way it gets taxed, or the way it gets communicated, or way you deal with flavors. There's nothing in the Framework Convention that stops that happening, except the will of the member states at this stage.
Thank you, Derek. Do we have another one in the room? I'm not sure who's next. Yes, sir. If you could introduce yourself and ask your question.
My name's Adrian Marshall. Question to the panel. Is there more that the tobacco industry and the nicotine industry could be doing to help to sort of break this impasse with the WHO and those in the sort of WHO orbit? Clearly, we've seen different strategies from different companies, acquisitions, new products, public statements of intent to end selling cigarettes, acquisition of medical device companies. Are these helpful? Do they actually, are they counterproductive? And are there other things that perhaps the companies themselves could be doing to try and demonstrate that they deserve a different perception?
Interesting one. Thank you. Who would like to take that? Derek.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important question. And, I can draw upon my experience when I was at PepsiCo, when I got asked that question by the CEO, Indra Nooyi, what can we in the food industry do together, knowing we are vicious competitors, and I still say the best competitors in the world are Coke versus Pepsi, knowing that Pepsi is the superior brand. But, and they got together around a couple of things. They agreed, number one, the 10, 12 top food multinationals needed to come up with a marketing to kids program that was sharp, that they were going to have externally audited and they were going to report to WHO on, and was going to meet the WHO criteria, plus the industry could certainly do that. There's nothing stopping them doing that. Some of the leading companies have got voluntary codes that are way beyond the text of the Framework Convention, and always will be, because member states keep dragging things down to a lowest common denominator. That would be a sign of incredible faith. It's unlikely to be done by all the companies, so who are the coalition of the willing? And I would say we know who they are. They're the companies I mentioned earlier, including the leading e-cigarette companies. That's one area. And it's pragmatic, it's serious. It takes the kids' issue not off the table, but it shows deadly seriousness. Because if a company says we are going to do X, it doesn't just then become an NGO thing. It becomes a thing for the way investors look at the companies. It becomes very serious, and they tend to act. The second, I think, is the area of information and knowledge. Again, we found this in the US. There was a real need to have a mechanism for companies to share what did they know about the underlying science in a way in which they weren't going to undermine their proprietary right to the information. Industry knows a lot about the consumer that the public health folk often have no clue about. They also have a body of knowledge that is now sitting at the FDA or going through the FDA processes. There have been documents that have gone into the SHARE report, outstanding documents that are beyond the ability of the public sector to really absorb them. How do they find a vehicle, a mechanism of an academic institution with the right legal oversight to actually craft on a regular basis what is the emerging science from the industry, which can be checked in terms of the methods and then gets put out as advances by the industry? And again, it would be the same coalition of the willing. And I could think of some other areas, but those two, getting the science and the information out to bridge the gap that we have between those who really know and are doing high-quality, cutting-edge science, which happens to be in industry, and those sitting in the public sector who are still looking at the size of pack warnings and what's the optimal size. Closing that gap will actually have a big impact on policymakers going forward.
Thank you,
great
Derek.
question. Thanks for
Thank you, Derek, and don't relax yet. We're working you hard. There's another question aimed at you, and this one has lots of likes online, I can see. It's from Andrew Thompson. Derek, why was snus not known or discussed more circa 2005? Surely the harm reduction potential of snus was, if not clear, at least hinted at that time.
It's a sad story, and as I put a big mea culpa, I can remember these discussions. I can remember people like Lars and Fagerstrom and many of the people coming and showing us the data. And the reaction generally was, this has got an industry behind us we don't trust, therefore we can't trust the data. It was as simple as that. And we were heavily blocked in our minds by where the data came from and the fact that this would actually, it was coming exactly when the light debate was hot, when the litigation in the US was hot, the 98 debate, and we were seeing how all the tricks and the dirty tactics of the industry were out there to try and undermine our progress. Why on earth would we believe this stuff coming from Sweden? A huge opportunity was lost. But as I said, the ultimate vindication must have been, it was the first product that went through the FDA authorization process. And despite that, the EU is still sitting with an archaic policy of banning it across the European Union. How on earth can that actually be tolerated? It just makes no sense.
Thank you, Derek. I think we'll take one more from the room before we wrap this up. And Ehsan, if you'd like to introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Ehsan from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. A couple of comments, I think. The first is that the foundation is committed to looking at the doctors' perceptions and the way they approach nicotine. So we have a survey underway for 12 countries to assess what the doctors think about nicotine, what their perceptions are, how do they advise their patients coming in. So that's underway, and that report should be available in the early part of 2022. The second comment is about what Harry said, that we may not know what the amount of Bloomberg funding going into opposition of the harm reduction. So there is a STOP campaign. STOP stands for, if I'm correct, Stopping Tobacco Organizations and Products. So 20 million was pledged in 2018, which is going to last till 2021. So that is dedicated at the STOP campaign, is dedicated towards anybody working on harm reduction or remotely associated with the tobacco industry. And the third point that I would really like to make is that WHO promises a lot. WHO promised us reforms. WHO promised us that it will have a better response for Ebola or some other COVID, but then we saw what happened in COVID. But my take on that is that it's the member states who fund through voluntary assessed contributions everything that WHO does. But if the countries are not stepping up to the plate, they leave a space for philanthropic activity to come in and fund WHO activities, and those funds, as we all know, are earmarked, especially for tobacco control when Bloomberg started funding WHO. So my question to the panel is, if the WHO wants to take control, or shouldn't it be the member states, the 192 member states, and also the 180 odd signatories to the Fctc, shouldn't they take back control and dictate what WHO needs to do? Or should it be the other way around, the WHO and Fctc Secretariat telling governments and member states and signatories of the Fctc on what to do on harm reduction?
Thank you very much, Ehsan. And let's pass this last question to Harry, because of course your report dealt directly with such questions.
Well,
so.
I mean, I think it's the way things at the moment, it suits all parties, I think. I mean, you've got WHO, that's obviously the Fctc, and the people who run the Secretariat have you know, like I said, they've got nicotine in their crosshairs, shifted the goalposts from smoking to tobacco, now to nicotine, in response to technological developments. You've got some of the biggest tobacco producers in the world sitting around the COP table, who no doubt see it definitely not in their commercial interests to support tobacco harm reduction. You've got smaller LMIC countries that don't have the capacity to do their own independent research, so they're quite happy to take whatever WHO says and tick a box that says, well, we've kind of dealt with that. There's issues in some countries with excise taxation where they don't want imported goods coming in, and most of the countries in LMIC regions do not have their own production for these products. If they did, they might take a slightly different approach to it. So I think there are a number of strands where everybody at the moment seems to be happy. You can either ignore the evidence, just do what the WHO says. You've got situations where people do not want to undermine their own domestic tobacco production, whether that's mainstream cigarettes or whether certainly in many countries, in India, Philippines, Indonesia, where they've got lots of local combustible products and also local oral products as well, which are which cause much death and disease. So, and tobacco control, as Derek says, has dropped right down the political radar, certainly since COVID, probably since the financial crash of 2002, 2008, probably goes back even further. So this coalition of the willing that Derek talks about is a different sort of coalition of the willing, a willingness just to go with the flow and act against tobacco harm reduction in any way that it possibly can.
Thank you, Harry. Many different signs of the complacency faced with this global catastrophe, let's face it, that Derek referenced earlier. We are out of time. We're going to break for lunch. I remind all of you in the room and those of you worldwide to rejoin us at 1:30 local time for our next session, Challenges in Making the Fctc an Inclusive International Framework, with a stellar lineup as well. It only remains for me to ask you to join me in thanking Tom Gleeson, Derek Yuck, and the author of this fantastic report, Harry Shapiro. Thank you.